Hello, and welcome to the Grow Places podcast, where we explore the virtuous circle of people, growth, and place. Brought to you by Grow Places and hosted by our founder, Tom Larson.
Richard, I've got a bit of a bone to pick with you.
Oh dear. You didn't tell me this before I signed up to this podcast.
I didn't.
Yeah.
Your podcast, Futures Cut, which is over 200 episodes, I just checked back,
Yes.
was so valuable and I really, really enjoyed it. So I want to say thank you for that first, but also call to action to maybe at some point in the future, if you can, do some more. I'd be really, really grateful for that.
Absolutely. Look, it's been a big part of what we've been doing here at Cushman's for a while now, and I've taken a bit of a break to concentrate on some of our internal stuff, but I'm pleased to say that that's kind of approaching a crest now. So watch this space, Tom. It would be my advice, and hopefully we'll get that going again in the next few months.
Awesome. Thank you. So what have you been doing at Cushman Wakefield then?
Yeah, so my job title is Head of Innovation at Cushman Wakefield for our EMEA region, and that obviously has a link to the kind of stuff that we've been talking about, futures and where the industry is going. I think if you don't have a clear view of where your industry is going, it's very difficult to innovate in that context. But then also what my day job is, I guess, at Cushman's is trying to figure out how we as a business should respond to that emerging new context for our industry, and trying to set the change pathways that allow us to evolve our business in line with our how we perceive our clients' needs of the future and our competitive landscape. So that covers quite a wide range of sins. But I kind of portfolio owner for things like digital transformation in Europe. I also have responsibility for our analytics group, which is quite significant in size now. And I work with business leaders to set transformation strategies. So that keeps me out of mischief or in mischief, depending on your position on that most days. And obviously keeping on top of how change is happening and helping guide our clients through that change as well is another part of my role that I really enjoy.
Yeah, amazing. And I'm really looking forward to diving into this in a bit more detail with you.
Sure.
As you know, I really enjoy our conversations whenever they arise. And I wanted to ask you a question just to hold in your mind that we'll kind of come back to at the end of the conversation, if that's okay. Mm-hmm. And I want you to, if I was to say, be as kind of provocative as you kind of dare to be within the realms of what you can, and directed at the real estate industry, what would be your response to that, given where we are now and everything that you're passionate about and interested in? So let's hold that
part
in your
for the
mind
end, is it?
and come back to that one.
I'll have a think about that. I don't mind being provocative.
That's good. That's good. More provocative, the merrier. So then, in terms of what you just described, then your role, because part of it is sort of thinking, isn't it, and strategizing, and part of it is doing. And that's quite a fine balance, isn't it, that we all have to face in our daily lives about, how much do we look forward and how much do we sort of focus on doing now. So how do you see that for yourself and for the business, and maybe for other businesses out there? What are the big things that people should be really focusing on at the moment?
Sure. I mean, I think that's a kind of a paradox for all businesses, isn't it? Is the kind of the need to think strategically in the long term, but also to get some things done in the shorter term. And most businesses have reasonably short term horizons that they need to respond to, as well as developing a long term strategy. I think I've personally probably had a little bit more luxury to develop a longer term view at Cushman's. That's been part of my role. I have come from a background in the business, providing agency and then consulting services to our clients, and then have transitioned through a role in kind of research and futures through to a strategy role, and then to my current role in innovation. And I guess on that journey, certainly in the strategy role and the futures role particularly, my job was all about the future. In the strategy role, I had to take some of those concepts that we'd developed about the future and translate them into how we arrange our resources in the platform. And I guess in the innovation role, that's a sort of, the implicit brief from my leaders was less talking and more doing. And look, I think every person who is a strategist who likes to think longer term doesn't just want to leave it there. Most people don't. They want to actually implement those strategies in a way that is impactful. And that's, I guess, what I've been focusing on for the last year or so, just to making sure that we're delivering on the way we're thinking and putting our talking to the walking, if that's the right, not mixing my metaphors. But yeah, and so that's why I've been really focused on that in the last 12 months particularly.
Yeah, and I think that's really important, isn't it, for real estate, well, for any sector. But when you look at real estate, we're obviously in the development space, and that's obviously particularly long term. But in a way, you're looking at the 10-year and you're looking at today in the same breath, because the decisions you make now have that impact at the product you're going to be creating over sort of 5-10 year period. So what are those kind of big waves? You've used that term with me in the past. What are the big waves that people should be riding and doubling down on?
Sure. I mean, I think firstly, you raise an interesting point on the time horizon. So if you think about, I mean, when we do things like futurology, we're thinking kind of 10 years plus usually on that horizon. And that's the only accurate or reliable way of predicting beyond that horizon, or at least creating scenarios about it. But things, some people think, well, that's just way too far off. How's that going to affect me today? And I think the thing I would say to people is things don't happen overnight. We're not going to wait for 9 years and 364 days and then suddenly all these changes are going to manifest. We're on a long burn path of transition towards that horizon. Now, if I was to ask, I think you asked me what are the big waves that I see at the moment, and there are two top ones which I think stand above all others. One is sustainability, which has really gained some traction in the last 5 years, I would say. I think we figured out as an industry quite late how important sustainability was going to be, not just from an ethical perspective, but on the impact on how we run our businesses in real estate, and particularly given how much of an exposure we have to carbon emissions, etc., in our industry. And that is I think that's very palpable here and now trend, but it's going to continue to develop probably more. The topic area is going to expand more, from more initial focus around environmental factors to, other more social factors over the next sort of 5 years. The other wave, which we've again seen palpably in the last 5 years, but is going to accelerate significantly, I think, in the next 5 years, is technology. And technology is a very big subject, right? And my lens, I've got a couple of lenses on this now. There's one lens which is a macro one, and if you think about how people use real estate or move around our cities, that's a kind of topic célèbre of mine in the last year. Technology is ameliorating the impact of distance. Communication technology, the internet, is changing the nature of distance. And if you consider how important distance or proximity is to real estate, I mean, the phrase, I think it was a Lansec phrase, came about 50 years ago, location. I think it became a TV show after that. But if location becomes less important because people can move ideas and information more readily across larger geographies, then that starts to reweight the balance of real estate. So from an economic perspective, that kind of particular element of technology, it also kind of substitutes the type of assets you might need, and that's obviously a kind of vicarious trend on that first one. But then if you look away from the kind of property market dynamics and more to industry dynamics, it's going to revolutionise how we do business. All players in the market, whether they're service providers like ours or developers like yourself or investors, we're going to see a very different way of operating in the next 10 years. Particularly, I think, if internet was the first wave, probably AI is now the next wave of that. So I think between those two trends, we've got a lot of change to absorb in our industry. I think the other one is probably just the kind of people who are in the industry. It's less my topic, but it's an important topic to our business more generally, is do we have the right skills? Do we have people in our business who reflect the diversity of the communities that we work in? And that's going to be an increasing focus, I think, for all businesses in our industry over the next 5 years. Yeah,
no, completely agree. And just with regards to those first two kind of macro factors that you talked about, sustainability, technology.
Yeah.
Where do you see the interlinkages between those two, and directly with the effect on real estate? Because I think that's where there's actually a huge amount as well around the speed of some of these impacts and how actually there's going to maybe be positive correlations between those two strands, but that may create more existential risk actually for some aspects of real estate, as well as obviously some opportunity.
I mean, I think the most obvious intersectional point is data. Most sustainability initiatives are data heavy. It's about tracking, monitoring, and then improving, and then retracking and monitoring. And I think we're getting much better at that in the environmental space. I think on the social side, it remains a little bit more intangible at the moment. But arranging our industry data in order to provide standardized metrics on sustainable achievement and the ability, therefore, to hit targets and communicate those to stakeholders, whether they're your prospective tenants or public authorities, I think that's going to be an incredibly important vehicle to deliver on sustainability initiatives in a way that proves out ROI. So I think that's a critical area that's going to, if we get our data house in order as an industry, which we haven't yet, in my view, then it'll shine a clearer spotlight on failing assets and drive the business case forward for redevelopment of those assets or repositioning of those assets in a way that delivers against those targets. That would be the main one. What do you think, Tom?
Yeah, no, I agree definitely with that on a kind of operational side. Something which, in preparation for this, I was listening back to some of your podcasts that you'd done, and you were talking about on the sort of the urbanistic scale, on the city scale of things as well. I think there's two aspects to that, isn't there? And maybe on the latter, then how's your view on how those things interrelate there?
Good point. Yeah, look, I mean, again, if you look at what is creating global warming or climate change, should I say, it's largely comes from real estate and transportation. Those two factors in themselves are the two biggest factors. And obviously those are related. If you think about how we work as a society, it changed quite fundamentally about 150 years ago. 300 years ago, most of us lived in extra urban areas. 150 years ago, most of us lived within 10-minute walk of where we worked. Then the train came along, and suddenly everybody made a choice to escape kind of difficult conditions in our inner urban areas and live in leafy suburbs. And particularly that was accelerated by the advent of the service industry in the mid-century last year. And so you've got this kind of gradual shift over the last sort of 300 years, but picking up in the last sort of maybe 70 years towards working in a very different place to where you live. And that's been hugely destructive of cities in many ways, and particularly the kind of more modern cities like in North America or Australasia, where they've designed their kind of cities around this kind of principle of commuting. Now, obviously, that's been quite clearly thrown up into the spotlight in recent years. I mean, first of all, through e-commerce, the ability to get stuff delivered to us. Not sure that helps sustainability, to be honest, but in a better programmed logistical environment, maybe it could. And obviously, more recently, in working from home or hybrid work model, fewer days commuting means less emissions, less floor space, i.e., we're very wasteful. And I'm not saying it's the wrong thing, but it's endemic in our system that we waste buildings. If you think about the building we're in today, this is going to be intensively used for 12 hours of the day. And for the other 12 hours, it's going to be not used at all, basically. And the opposite is pretty much true of my house at home. So it's going to be not used in the daytime, and then it's going to be quite intensively used in the nighttime. Now, what working from home has done is allow us to coincide and get more utility out of the home. Now, your point is, will that precipitate an acceleration of obsolescence in real estate stock? I mean, on the face of it, yes, it will do. I think the impact will be more tempered than some have given cause for concern about, because it's very difficult actually to rationalise the amount of office space, particularly if everybody's turning up on Wednesday, right? You've still got to have a lease that's full capacity for the week. What that doesn't do is help your sustainability argument, and I think there'll be people looking quite hard at that across the world in the next 5 years is how do we gain greater utility from our assets in a way that matches the demand more readily to the supply. Very difficult. I mean, I'm not going to sleep in this office. I've done it once. I shouldn't probably say that, but I'm not going to make a practice out of sleeping in this office.
Yeah.
I probably find it easier to work at home as a trade-off. But other things like how do shops turn into restaurants at night? There are definitely crossover concepts there that provide us an indication of where we might go to get greater utility. But I think as a world, as an industry, we can't be in the business of creating very carbon intensive assets that we only use for a small part of the week.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you mentioned the theme around distance earlier on in this discussion, and simplicity from my mind, what technology does is it collapses distance in terms of how we could relate to each other. We could have a FaceTime call with someone in Australia and you feel like you're in front of them, or if you look at what Meta are doing, with the VR and other things, you can literally actually feel like you are experientially in the same room as each other. So the technologist version of collapsing distance is through technology.
Very much.
Whereas in our industry, we talk about the need for connection, the need to be together, the need to collaborate, and these themes are definitely at the forefront of the narrative around the why to cities and the why to office buildings and to other things. It's about bringing people together. So they're almost like the same narrative ran in completely different ways, and probably they're both true. There's an element of that, but how do you see some of that panning out when you think about the way that cities are operated, but also fundamentally, as you say, how we live and work, and where we do that.
Yeah, I mean, first thing I said, I don't think they're dichotomous kind of theories there. I think that they work in harmony with each other. I think what technology does very well is ameliorate the cost of distance for things that don't require proximity. But not everything doesn't require proximity still, right? And there are some things which we as humans find more valuable to do in person. Certainly, it would be my take on things. I think probably you need to draw that line of where, but quite clearly on a typical day in the office, it's not full of collaborative activities still. There's still a lot of admin associated with most office jobs that can be more readily done, or it can be done anywhere, and we make a choice then about where we want to do it. I think there's quite a lot of evidence now building up post-pandemic about why what is the right thing to do in what location. I think what was clear coming out of the pandemic is actually people adjusted pretty well to administrative work. Particularly, we don't have paper files in professional services anymore. You don't need access to the infrastructure and technology in the same way you do, because it's all in the cloud now. And also, actually, interestingly, one-on-one conversations with your line manager actually work pretty well in a hybrid environment, often because actually managers were forced to put in one-on-one meetings to address the fact they didn't have the tap on the shoulder opportunity anymore that they used to have. What is equally true, though, however, is the fringe network connections just fell off a cliff completely. So if you weren't planning to see somebody, you're not going to bump into them on a Teams call. Like, that's not the way it works, right? And we saw some exploratory kind of ideas about the metaverse kind of coming out a couple of years ago, but I think they're probably 10 years too early right now. Now, of course, what will happen over time is technology will continue to improve. That is a truism. That has always happened and will always happen. And as it does so, the fidelity differential between the real world and virtual worlds will start to reduce, which might encourage more activity in the virtual worlds. So I think we've got to watch out for that as a progressive trend in our industry. I come back to when we were doing some thinking about the future of cities and what that, why cities were valuable. I kind of posited three factors as being important. One was amenity, the second was agglomeration, and the third was serendipity. So amenity means I'm near a source of my wealth, I'm near a shop or near a train station, those kind of things add value. That's being killed by the internet largely. Agglomeration means not being near a thing, but being near other people, a group of people who can coalesce around an idea. And I think that still has a strong resonance in today's economy and social culture. But it's definitely softening because you can now have agglomerations of people online. I mean, I work in a team of multinational people in my role, and we work through a teams, we don't see each other every day and we make it work. But serendipity is the thing that I think is going to really drive the performance and value proposition of cities going forward. And that means providing reasons to bump into other people or creating the conditions where people will bump into each other. At the moment, I don't think the digital world can offer that. And I think that will remain a strong value attractor for businesses to encourage people into offices as part of their role in the future. I guess there's another kind of bigger question about distance, though, which is, the way you frame that question, I think rightly so, because it's the immediate impact is, and the way a lot of people frame that question is, does that mean people can work at home now and then commute less often to an office? Well, to take that to another degree, like people might not need to be in the same country anymore. And I think that in itself could be a far more impactful outcome of this than people working a couple of days from home a week.
Yeah, no, I agree. Thank you. That's super insightful. And so what is you mentioned value proposition there for cities, this kind of, this attractor, this almost like the brand of places, whether it's cities or whether it's towns or whatever. So how do places attract and retain people and businesses?
Yeah. So I think, again, like most things in life, they've got to do two things. They've got to they've got to deliver well on hygiene factors or ameliorate the negative factors of failing to hit hygiene factors. And they've got to provide a wow factor, a pull. So,
sorry to interrupt. Can you just define what you mean by hygiene factors and wow factors in there?
Yeah, sure. So hygiene factors would be things that people take for granted, that, not that necessarily, you're not going to go out and buy something because it delivers against a hygiene factor, but it's the kind of thing you get pissed off about if it's not done well. So if you go on your train in the morning and the seats are squeaky and there's not enough room to sit down and you can't get good internet, those are hygiene factors that people now baked into their expectations of how that would work. And typically there was, who was it? It was, come back to me, one of the kind of big kind of management thinkers described that if you don't hit hygiene factors well, people are likely to complain, but they're not necessarily likely to buy as a consequence of that. Right. Whereas in order to drive motivation, you need to then provide something that people get excited about, something that makes them feel their life has got better, not that from that baseline rather than got worse. So if you think about that in a city context, hygiene factors are things like housing costs. If people can't afford to own a home or rent a home, that is going to be a problem. And it's going to create, therefore, push factors away from our cities. But I remember, I'm from Yorkshire originally. I came down to London in my early 20s. I was happy to accept whatever house. I didn't need a lot of space. And the reason I came down to London was it was the Dick Whittington story of like the bright lights and the fun. And a lot of people do choose cities around that still. I think people choose cities because of the wow, and they leave cities because of the hygiene. And I think cities like London, where we are today, have performed hugely successfully over the past 10 years, and they still perform really well on some of these wow factors, the excitement, etc. But they're starting to show a little bit of challenge around the hygiene factors, housing, pollution, well-being, free time, and it's those kind of things that the big cities around the world, the global megacities, are going to need to put a real focus on in the next 10 years. Whereas maybe the smaller second-tier cities, where there's not as many issues present in that regard, they're the ones that are going to have to compete on the wow factors. That would be my take on it, Tom.
Yeah, that makes total sense.
Yeah.
And there's also stages of life in that, aren't there? Because the younger you are, typically, the more wow you're after, and the higher hygiene you will accept. And as you move through life, then that sort of changes, doesn't it?
Completely. Yeah. I mean, obviously, the biggest dimension comes in housing. So when you have kids living in a 500 square foot flat in central London, which might have worked in your 20s, 30s, suddenly becomes less appealing. And you put a different stall on that. And so, if look, I mean, this particularly affects the big cities, and I'm talking maybe 2-3 mil plus in size. Most cities that are 1 million or down have still got kind of reasonably sensible commute times, and therefore housing costs, because the land cost on the edge of cities is still relatively affordable. Whereas you get to a city of the scale of London, but actually it's not as bad in London because we've got good public transport, we've got quite high density living. If you go to some of the North American cities where they're kind of arranged, or the Australian cities I was saying before, they're arranged in a way that promotes low density urban sprawl and no infrastructure, that's when you've got like a 2-hour drive to work in the morning that you can't be productive on. And that becomes probably the overriding consideration for an employee as to whether to turn up to the office that day. No matter how many kind of free croissants you provide, that's going to be a difficult bar to overturn. And I think also you've got to think about like who when you think about wow factor, to your point about age, like when I was younger, I was going out every night. Now, I go out, I'd like to say once a week, but I don't, if I'm honest. Yeah. And I'm home. I'm home by 10 o'clock. So I'm feeling quite sad now.
I was going to say 10 o'clock. You're living the dream.
Yeah, I need to rethink my life maybe. But when that's your modus, you're happy to accept a good night out in a big city less frequently than you are when you're younger, which means you're prepared to live a bit further away where you don't have all access to that amenity on a day-to-day basis, in order to get the private amenity like a garden or a extra bedroom or a garage or something like that.
Yeah, definitely. Because it's interesting, isn't it? When I was just thinking about this when you were saying that, it's the inertia around changing places, transport networks, buildings is so high.
Yeah,
it's slower. It's much slower. The pace of change in the digital space in these other spaces is so much quicker, isn't it? So
completely.
So historically, as you've said, big shifts in how people live fundamentally and work, has been driven by infrastructural changes as much as it has by kind of at least information technology.
Yeah.
But now the information technology side of things is so much quicker that those companies, whether it's Microsoft Teams or others, they see that as an opportunity to capitalize on. So let's sort of solve those pain points by producing a product that makes it quicker to do that. But now those things are, as I say, move at a quicker pace than the ability to build affordable homes or build new towns or change a commercial district into a vibrant mixed-use district.
Yeah.
So do you see anything in that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, product life cycle is a really important factor to consider in any innovation, right, as well. So, typically if you kind of look in a book of product life cycles, you'll have like fast fashion or, consumer technology at one end of the spectrum, and then you'll have aeroplanes at the other end. But we're beyond aeroplanes, right? Yeah. So, most commercial assets would have an economic lifespan of 30 years plus, and a technical lifespan, well in excess of that. If I look at my house as an example, like it was built in 1650, I'm still living it. Well, I wasn't living it in 1650, but with some modifications, internal modifications, electricity, toilet got moved inside, all of those kind of things. My house is still standing after 350 years. Whereas, I buy the next iPhone every year. So what that does is, if you imagine that that's the context into which innovation happens, like long product life cycle, short product life cycles. If you're then faced with a period of consumer change, or and in the real estate industry, most of our businesses are B2B. So let's say that's kind of corporate attitudes change, or the requirements of the workspace change, or the shop. You're not going to be able to market in the same way that if there's a consumer shift in the technology space, or fast fashion, a great example. Every season, new fashion comes out, you put the old one in the bin. Not very sustainable, but that's what a lot of people do. And businesses need to therefore be very innovative in order to keep on top of that trend. Real estate has got away with being not very innovative for a couple of reasons. One is because consumer demand for real estate hasn't changed quickly, but the second is it can't change quickly, and so even if it did, there'd be a problem. Now, and then what we see is every so often a disruptor kind of peeps through in our industry. I mean, we saw that with some of the flex operators in recent years, and suddenly that could precipitate, if that becomes a snowball, it can precipitate massive obsolescence in assets which would otherwise maybe have another 20 years on their of value from them. So innovating in the real estate space is tough, but it carries huge benefits as well. I mean, again, we see that through this period of change in the office market. Those assets which are coming out of the ground now, which are marked to modern demand, almost there's now a binary of like some corporate occupiers will only select those assets, whether it's the way they're kind of configured or the sustainability features of the asset, and that risks putting a whole other genre of stock out of business overnight. That's a real watch out for investors at the moment. And of course, obviously my business is not a property business, it's a professional services business. And so we can mark to market a lot quicker. But, obviously that's about the service provision rather than the underlying asset change. So you've got those two paces of change in the real estate industry. There's organisational change, technology, data, those kind of things. And then there's physical asset change, which is much more challenging, I think, at the moment.
Yeah. And so in that physical asset change world, which is effectively what space we're in, obviously, as a developer, a regeneration company.
Yeah.
How do you see those companies being most successful on a kind of, on a corporate level, but then how do you see them being most impactful really in terms of how they improve people's quality of life?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, so if you think about, my background's in development, to kind of declare my hand here, but if you think about a typical, like not a sort of, not a kind of, a big kind of development project, what would you be? You'd be like, you'd need a year to buy it, or, then you'd need like a couple of years in like the discovery and planning phase. You're then doing mobilization, you're doing development, and then you let it. So you could be like 6-7 years away from the point of consumer demand, which is terrifying, like absolutely terrifying in a market that's moving quickly. So, particularly for developers, less so for investors who are immediately accretive day one, developers need more than any other business to be thinking what's going to happen in the future. Because if you design your asset around what's needed today, you've almost certainly lost the game. So either you've got to design it for the future, or you've got to retain inherent flexibility in the design such that you can adapt it at a later phase in the development process. So I think nimble, agile developers who can think beyond the horizon, predict future need, and respond to that need in a way that creates value from a balanced scorecard perspective. I think that's going to be really important. That's important to the value proposition of those firms. I think also, if I was to kind of chance a look at that kind of 6-7 year horizon, the kind of trends we've been talking about, technology, sustainability, but particularly social sustainability, is going to be a bigger factor in the future than it is now. And that starts to go not just to the product type, but also the funding model, and also the business the business model of the, how do you go about funding and developing and investing in those assets? But as I was saying earlier, this won't happen overnight. It's going to be progressive trends. So if you've bought into an old value model that doesn't anticipate these trends, it's going to pose a business risk in your development plan, in my mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And we talk about growth on this platform.
Yeah.
In all its senses, but in a recognizing that there's some downsides to growth, but also trying to be optimistic and talk about it in a really positive sense. So, So how do you see that? I don't know whether it's kind of inclusive growth or however you want to describe it. Some of these factors that we're talking about around affordability, around access.
Yeah. I mean, I think you've got to start with a baseline, which is cities inherently promote inequality. I probably should explain myself with that, but if you think about how land allocation works in our cities, not in a kind of artificially constrained market like a government controlled country, like a communist regime or something like that. the land is allocated with preference to those people who can afford to pay the most. And that's why our high streets are full of chain stores that have the most efficient operating model that allows them to kick off the highest residual rent. And similarly, the people who can afford to live in the most advantageous locations in our cities are the people who do best. And then the people who can't afford that then suffer systemic disadvantage in other areas. So if you can't afford to live in next to Hyde Park, most of us can't, right? But let's say you're now forced out to, an estate on the edge of town. That means probably your commute time is almost certainly going to increase, which carries a social penalty, carries a financial penalty as well for people commuting in. It also, those locations, because cities get less dense as you move out, tend to have more dispersed infrastructure. So you've probably got a longer walk to the shops. You've probably got less shops. You're not going to have an opera house on the edge of the city if that's your bag. So other disadvantages. And also, edge of cities tend to have worse pollution, and they tend to have higher housing-related health issues. So cities force people in. They penalise people who can least afford to be penalised. How do you solve that? Very, very difficult. In the most part, it comes through conscious placemaking, in my mind, and it comes through having a long-term view on estate management. It also comes through building more housing, right? Because that's the biggest challenge to people at the moment, and our housing stock of the last century isn't going to stand the test of time, in my opinion. So how do we create sustainability or social sustainability going forwards through real estate? I think it needs greater concerted effort with large-scale placemaking and partnerships with the public sector to create more thoughtful developments. I think it also requires probably more willingness to be interventionist from our government perspective. I've worked across the country and abroad, actually, on a number of big regen projects, and the willingness of the local authority to compulsory purchase assets in a way that unlocks the future development value is critical to the viability of those schemes. If you look even at somewhere like Milton Keynes, that was purchased for agricultural value, which then allowed them to build a city on there that had enough economic residual to invest in placemaking initiatives. You might not consider the roundabouts to be good placemaking now, but at the time it was groundbreaking, and they planted 1 million trees in Milton Keynes before it even set up. And unless we can acquire land at a value which allows us the economic surplus to reinvest in the community, it becomes quite challenging to deliver that. That's part of the broken economic model that we live in.
Yeah. I
suspect a lot of property investors listening to this might not agree with me, because obviously you want certainty of the value of your asset, and you want to basically be allowed to be a land speculator, but land speculation does carry a cost to society, and that's something we're going to have to decide our position on as a society.
Yeah, really interesting, and no, I agree with a lot of what you're saying there. But if I was to try and play like maybe the devil's advocate, or maybe the public's view on this as best I can, it would be that, well, if you look back over history, you look at, garden cities may be an okay example, but you look at some of the other big, broad brush, really optimistic sort of city making, place making strategies, whether it's streets in the sky or whatever it might be. A lot of them are looked back on really negatively in terms of how they've actually affected how people live, really, and the prospects and opportunities for people. And maybe, as you say, you live in a 16th century house you're referring to, but you look back at sort of the Victorian terraces and those periods, maybe there's some positives to how those are portrayed, albeit they've now got big issues with, how do they become more sustainable, more energy efficient? So I guess what I'm saying is kind of, do you have a view on what that sort of vision maybe looks like going forward?
I think the start point of this is active planning. Is only 100 years old, right? That's how long we've been actively trying to plan our cities, and that's in the UK, and we were leading the world on that in many respects. And the moment you start to not let the market decide and you start to actively plan the allocation of uses, you've got to have a hypothesis for those. And we didn't really have a hypothesis. We had some poor hypotheses, I think. Most of them were, coming back to our previous discussion, actually quite anchored around convenience. They thought that people would want major roads running through city centres to funnel people out. They thought people would want to live outside cities by themselves. But what we've learned over the last century is that that's not really what people want. They want a finer grain of interaction. They don't want their cities to be dominated by cars. They don't want urban sprawl. They like living in communities. I would like to think that we now have the empirical backstory to this that starts to point us in a direction for the future. But obviously the world continues to evolve and change. So who knows? But I think I'm attracted to proposals that have high density but well managed high density. When I lived in London, I used to live in Bayswater, which is one of the most dense areas of London. But you wouldn't tell that because it doesn't look like high rise. It's kind of mid-story, 5-6-story housing. But it was nice white stucco fronted buildings surrounding garden squares, which provided an interaction venue for people who are resident there, local amenities, like very much a 15-minute city kind of feel in Bayswater. Now, is that a unique kind of privileged location in London? I don't think it needs to be. I think that could be delivered in most areas of the world. And I look at the mistakes of the past. I think I see, I come from Hull originally. I see a lot of bungalow type social housing. We see that in the Americas also. I also see the way of density being delivered being a tower block in the middle of a field sort of thing, which creates no defensible space or no venues for interaction. So I think if we can come up with a better proposition around density, a well-managed density, I think that's on a winning strategy. And then make sure the infrastructure is embedded at the outset. Again, you don't develop that well on a plot-by-plot basis, so you need master developers in that framework to secure the infrastructure that wouldn't be developed individually.
Awesome. Yeah. Awesome. Richard, I could talk to you about this stuff all day, but I'm going to circle back to this question that I asked you at the top. Yeah. So if I was to ask you to be as provocative as you dare and directing that to the real estate industry, what would be your sort of response right now?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think it's always easy to be the guy who says, right, we're on the cusp of massive change is about to happen. But I'm going to be that guy because what I see here is an undercurrent of different trends developing that feel a bit like an iceberg. And there'll be a moment where that iceberg pops out the water and sinks some ships. And I think that time's quite close for the property industry. And I think that's true for all elements of the property industry. If you think the product mix in the way we've talked about is changing, the economic model underpinning property is changing. And in the next 5 years, the way we operate as businesses within the industry is going to change significantly. Now, I think it's suited most people in the industry to not change, because of some of we talked about long product life cycles, but also personal defensiveness. We talked to, alignment to the interests of the stakeholders, not really there. The industry is misaligned in many respects. And at some point, there's going to be a point where this starts to become challenged. And that comes when disruptors from outside of our industry pop in and say, we can do this better than you guys. I think that time is now. If you look particularly on the technology side, I think what we've seen in the finance space over the last 10 years, that's the biggest sort of series of asset classes globally, or business investable asset classes globally. Like, we're a very close second, particularly if you put residential into there. And so that attention, that kind of private equity attention that's been focused on the financial assets is now going to be focused on real assets in the next 10 years. And those who are not willing to change, I think, will become very irrelevant in a very short space of time. There will be a blockbuster moment for our industry. That's why I guess my role exists. It's try to help figure out what's going to happen and then try and be proactive about addressing it. But there are some things that a firm in itself can't do. It's an industry that needs to do it in collaboration. I don't think we've collaborated well enough as an industry on key factors. Sustainability starting to get there, diversity tentatively, technology we haven't really collaborated at all in terms of data, etc. Leaves ourselves very open to other people outside our industry to say we can do it better than you can. And if that doesn't worry people on who are listening to this, you probably need to think again. Or you're doing your job much better than I am, maybe. But I think the final point I've made, Tom, is change shouldn't be feared. Change is really good. It's really positive. People can unlock huge opportunities in their life through change. And I think when you're younger, you're much more open to change because you see that as part of your life's experience. But when you're older, you've got more to lose and you feel more concerned to maintain the status quo. But my advice to those listening, if they're willing to take it, is be open to change, because I think that through change and embracing it, you can unlock a lot of fear and mistrust and actually look at ways to improve your life, but also the people who you work for on the planet. And I think that's, in the property industry, we've got a very rare opportunity to do that in a way that many other industries don't. So change coming, you should be concerned about it, but only to the extent that you're not willing to change, would be my view.
Richard, it's a great way to end, and there's a lot for people to think about, but also to really throw themselves into and be optimistic about there too. So
absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you for your time.
Thanks for inviting me, Tom. Cool.
Thank you for listening to the Grow Places podcast. For more information, visit growplaces.com and follow us at We Grow Places across all social channels. See you next time.